Hey everybody, this is Ben dropping you a quick note. Our editors have been working hard to get episodes finished to release on schedule with the reading of the week. Our hope is that listeners will have the chance to engage with the content and share meaningful ideas in their circles of family, friends, and church. In order to meet this goal, this episode has been released with minimal editing. We are looking for additional volunteers to join the team and help with editing, social media management, and content creation. If you are interested, please reach out to us on Facebook or email latterdaypeacestudies@gmail.com. You can also donate to the project, helping us cover the costs of things like website hosting and podcast platform fees. Donations can be made through PayPal by going to our website, latterdaypeacestudies.org, clicking Get Involved, and scrolling down to the donate box. Thanks so much to all who have helped out and donated over the years. We are sincerely grateful. Latter-day Peace Studies is produced by peace-loving members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Any views expressed herein are not to be taken as official positions of the Church or its authorities.
Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I'm Christopher Hurtado.
And I'm Ben Peterson.
Thank you for joining us as we discuss this week's reading of Come Follow Me as outlined by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Our hope is that as we discuss the Scriptures, we will come to a more perfect understanding through experiencing the atonement of Jesus Christ and find greater peace in our lives.
Welcome back to Latter-day Peace Studies. I'm Ben Peterson.
And I'm Christopher Hurtado.
Today we will be discussing Luke chapter 22 and John chapter 18. Now, we have said this a few times now as we're going through the curriculum here, that some of these chapters feel like they are out of place in terms of the way the reading is divided up. I think, Christopher, if you and I were in control, we would have put Luke chapter 22 a couple weeks ago when we were talking about Matthew chapter 26 and the others that go along with it, because it's the same events, right? And there's comparisons to be had there that were really helpful if you were talked about it at the time. So that's what we ended up kind of doing. We ended up talking about Luke chapter 22 anyway, so we'll cover some of those things again. And then John chapter 18 really would have fit in with the flow of the narrative last week in some ways, but, obviously you don't want to cover too many chapters in 1 week, but yeah.
Well, but we also could have taken John 13 and included that. Well, then that would be more chapters, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, if you divided up the John ones, like you did 13 through 15, right? And then 16 through 18, right? Something like that. It seems like it would have fit better with the flow. Of course, if we had done it, we probably would have just started in the book of Mark and done all of Mark. And then done all of Matthew, and then done all of Luke, and then done all of John, or something like that, right? Like,
I don't know, though. Another approach is the Gospel Parallels approach, and that's why we put together the document. And again, we're sharing that. If you would like to share your email address with us, we'll share the Gospel Parallels document with you. It has the same information that's in the back of your quad and in the back of your standard works, if you're a Latter-day Saint, and you just imagine that you have all the parallels, but we include the text. And so you can actually read side by side. I think I would have taken that approach, Ben, but I can see why you would take that other approach. Either one would be better than this one. we're doing the best we can with this one. So there's one other thing to say, and that's back in John 14, Jesus says something like, let's go, to his disciples. And they're off to the garden is what we read in the other Gospels, right? But here in John, they don't actually go anywhere until chapter 18. So he says, let's go in 14, and then we have 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. They're still there, still talking at dinner. The whole intercessory prayer happens at dinner, not in the garden, which I think I assumed it was in the garden. You said you did too, Ben.
Yes, I assumed it was in the garden previously.
So with that, let's talk about Luke 22. So one of the things I want to cover here, because again, the way the curriculum has been, I feel like it's important to repeat some of these things in case you have lost the plot or you haven't been listening. And that is to distinguish between what each gospel author says Judas did and why he did it, right? And then what happens to him after that, right? In the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, we get that Judas goes to talk to the authorities about handing over Jesus. Now, the King James Bible says betraying, but the verb to hand over is used all over the place in the New Testament, and it's always translated hand over, except when Judas does it, and then it's a betrayal.
Because he's the betrayer.
Right. Yeah. So last time, or maybe the time before that, I talked about the Gospel of Judas and how Judas is actually the one in that gospel who really gets what's going on. And I actually compared it to the Latter-day Saint view of Eve, right? Eve had to eat of the fruit, right? If the Gospel of John is telling us that Jesus came to die, then he has to be handed over so that he can die. And so Judas is doing the thing to make sure that he does.
He's just playing his part in the plot.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So in the Gospel of Judas, which is a Gnostic gospel, he's the one who gets it. He understands what needs to happen, and the other disciples don't get it. Now, it's not hard to see the other disciples as not knowing what's going on. I think the whole New Testament paints the disciples that way in all the Gospels, right? But this one, the Gospel of Judas, that is, tells us that Judas did know what's going on. Jesus taught him secretly, and so they're kind of working together to make sure that Jesus's purpose gets carried out. And so again, he looks like Eve to me in the Latter-day Saint tradition in that sense. So in Mark, we get that Judas goes to talk to the authorities about handing over Jesus, and they offer him money. He didn't go asking for it. In Matthew, it looks like he's negotiating for money, right? He wants to see how much he can get, so it's all about the money. In Luke, Satan enters him, and that's why he does it. And in John, it's a lot like Luke, right?
Yeah.
And so then what happens to him? What happens to him in Matthew, he repents, right? He wishes he hadn't done it. He gives the money back and he hangs himself. And the temple priests can't really use the money because it's blood money. They can't use it for the temple. So they buy a piece of land with it. It's a land of red clay. And it's this field, right? And you're going to use it to bury strangers. And they call it the field of blood, right? Because it's purchased with blood money. And it was already red in color. But that's not what we get in Acts. Now, so Mark, Luke, and John don't mention anything about this, except that Luke is supposed to be the author of Acts. So it's sort of like a sequel to Luke, or what did you call it?
Luke 2. Yeah.
Luke 2, right?
Or second
yeah.
Luke, right? We have first and second Nephi.
Second Luke, right. Luke. So we can think of Acts as second Luke. And so in Acts, we get that he already owned the field. Judas owns the field of blood, and it's called the field of blood because he just goes there and his guts just spill out, and it's a bloody mess. And there's no mention of anyone stabbing him or him stabbing himself. It's as if God did it, right? His guts just spill out. And so that's what happens to him in that. So there are different versions of this story. So here we're in Luke, right? Chapter 22. So it's Satan who enters him, and he goes away to speak with the high priest, and he's not there, right? So now who's left are the other 11 disciples with Jesus.
So Jesus tells his disciples to go into the town and to find a person that's carrying a jar of water. Now, both in the KJV and the NRSV, it says a man carrying a jar of water. But when we look up the Greek, it's ambiguous, right? It's just a person. And it's really unlikely that a man would be carrying water. This would be typically a woman doing this. And so there's a couple things that could be going on here. One, the text could be ambiguous on purpose because, like you were saying, Christopher, before we started recording, when we were discussing this, it would be a little odd for them to be just following a woman somewhere to a house unseemly.
A strange woman at night.
Yeah, a strange woman, yeah. But at the same time, it's weird for it to be an actual man doing this, so it's ambiguous. The other thing that came out to me about it, though, is that if it is a man carrying the pitcher of water or the jar of water, then this would be obvious, right? Because it's out of place. And so it would stand out, and they would be able to find this person easily because it's a man carrying a jar of water, and it's not done, right?
Yeah, it might also stand out to have a woman wandering around carrying the water at night.
Yes.
And the reason we know that is because if we trust Rudin, right, she's saying they wouldn't be following a strange woman at night. That would be unseemly. Then we have the Last Supper, where we get our sacrament, right? I was just going to point out here, Ben, that when Jesus is sharing a cup, that's not a unique event. Right. It's how it's done, right? Everybody shares one cup. And as a matter of fact, that was true in our tradition, right? Until the 1918 pandemic, right?
Yeah, it was true in our tradition of having the sacrament that, it was very common that the entire congregation would share one cup. And it was around the time of the flu pandemic that we went to these individual cups. And it's interesting because we also had some, sacramental procedural changes with the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of that's kind of been rolled back, changed, back to the way it was before. But in any case, we kind of see these kinds of things for social or societal changes or cultural changes as well.
That's right. I was surprised when I was in Syria in 2010 studying Arabic, and at the exit from the Hamadiya Souk, the bazaar as it's called in Turkish, and usually in English we use the Turkish word. There's a guy standing there selling drinks, and he just has sort of a backpack, and he pumps the drink from his backpack, and he uses one cup. And everybody drinks from the same cup, and he just wipes it. I think he poured a little water in it, swished it, and then wiped it. And I've seen this done in Mass too, where everybody drinks from the same cup and it's just wiped.
Yeah, it's culturally taboo for us, I would say. One of the things that stood out to me here in these verses about the Lord's Supper, or the sacrament as we call it, is that they first drink wine, then they have the bread, and then they have wine again. So this is a different order than we would be used to, or not just a different order, but a different procedure. And one of the commentary on this said that this might be highlighting some of the variations that were among the early Christians, the different groups, the different congregations, in how the Lord's Supper was practiced. Maybe some of them did the wine first and then the bread, and some of them did the bread and then the wine. And so here we have the wine, then the bread, then the wine. I guess that kind of covers all of them.
Yeah, the other thing I remember bringing this up pre-show, and I'd like to bring this up here for you to talk about it, Ben, because I can see how he's saying, do this in remembrance of me. And remember that all of Jesus's ministry was about shared meals. And so this could just be another shared meal.
Yeah. Or he's instituting it as a thing, right? It's like, oh, okay. And then, we've done all these shared meals, but this is the thing you want to do in remembrance of me. Yeah.
Right. And so it doesn't have to be sort of this, sacrament, right? It doesn't have to be a sacrament, but it is part of what Jesus does, right? He has these shared meals with his disciples. And so it occurred to me that there of course, there's nothing wrong with it being the sacrament, right? That's what we do. But I wonder if how we approach it might be different if we thought of it as another shared meal, like all the shared meals we've been reading about in Jesus's ministry. And so remember that when we remember Jesus, and we've talked about this, I'm pretty sure, on this podcast, and I know we've talked about it in our sister podcast, Latter-day Contemplation. Remember isn't a mental operation. The bread has been broken. If it's the body of Christ, he's been dismembered. And so when we remember, it's bringing it all back together, and it's done in the community of Christ, in the community of Christ's followers. And so just like in the Bible, when it says in the New Testament, when it says your body is a temple, right? The you is plural. And so it's not this individual thing, right? It's the body of Christ. And so Jesus wants to live, as it were, in the community that calls itself Christian.
Some of the symbolism for this was preserved. Well, first, when you have the bread, and it's broken, every single piece of bread is always unique, right? So it's individual for each person. But then you had that single cup that everybody drank from. And so it was, like you said, dismembered. And then it was brought back together in the fact that everybody drank from the same cup. And so the symbolism of that unity, the dismembering in the bread, and you're taking that into you, and then you're coming back into a unity when you drink out of the same cup. Some of that symbolism was preserved with that concept.
Yeah, another thing we talked about, Ben, pre-show, is this idea that it's mentioned here in Luke that this is a new dispensation. Right? And so we do have, from the Old Testament, we have blood and covenants related to each other, right? We have some things in Jeremiah, some things in Exodus, but it's not really clear what is meant here by new. But there's more to this, right, Ben? You said that this isn't in all the manuscripts.
That's correct. Yeah. Luke has it as new, and that is, apparently in all the manuscripts of Luke, or most of them. But in Matthew and Mark, not all the manuscripts of those Gospels have the word new in them. So sometimes it's just covenant, not necessarily new covenant.
Going back to Judas again, in verse 21, we have that the hand of the one who's giving me up, as Rudin has it, is with me on the table. Now, I read this and I thought, okay, his hand's on the table, right? His actual hand is resting on the table. And you think, really, his is the only hand on the table?
Yeah, is there not somebody else too? Yeah.
Right. But this could be, the hand is often used as a symbol of the power and volition of a person, right? So maybe we could read it that way.
Yeah, so Mark and Matthew have Judas's hand in the dish with Jesus, and that's the indication that he's the one that's going to hand him over or betray him. And then John says that Jesus actually dips the bread and then hands it to him. And so these are just three different indications or different ways that Jesus indicates Judas as the betrayer, so to speak.
It occurs to me, Ben, that John, in the Gospel of John, we see Jesus more in control of everything than in all the other Gospels, right?
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so he is the one initiating it. He takes the bread, dips it, and hands it. And there's no action on the part of Judas that joins in that. It's all Jesus that's making that happen. That is an interesting subtlety there.
Another thing that's interesting to me is in verses 22 and 23, the disciples are arguing about who it is who's going to betray Jesus or hand him over, right? And I thought it was already clear then.
Jesus just said who it was, yeah.
Right. Yeah. But then that quickly turns into an argument about who's the greatest.
Yeah, and this is, in other Gospels, this argument or this discussion happens at a different time, not at this time. So it either happened twice, as, sometimes people would like to say when they're trying to reconcile the Gospels, or this was just a place where they felt like it fit with the flow of the discussion, right? Because if you're talking about who's going to betray him, then it's going to turn to, oh no, well, I'm loyal, I would never, I'm more loyal than you, and da-da-da-da, like that kind of thing.
Right. So I have a cultural note on this, right? So Jesus is saying something like the kings of foreign nations act as their masters, and those who have power over them are called benefactors. This is Ruden's translation. These benefactors in this society, you have this sort of client-patron relationship, and the patrons are the benefactors, and they're not only sought after for personal favors, but they also provide public works, right? So if they would build a building for the people, then their name would be on it. And Jesus is saying, that's not how we do it, right? You're not doing this to get praise in public. It's part of your religious devotion that you serve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to the point of the kingdom here, he's explaining to them that his kingdom is different than these other kingdoms. And in fact, he's gonna confer this kingdom upon them, right? What does Ruden say? Sign it over to them, right?
Well, that's as I put it, right? She says, I make over the kingdom to you.
Yeah.
Hence, I make over the kingdom to you, just as my Father made it over to me.
Yeah. When I read this, it made me think of some of the statements that we get from Joseph Smith when he's talking with his inner circle with his close associates before his death. We have this in some of the notes of the Council of 50 and other things like that, where he says, he's giving them all the keys to the kingdom, right? He's conferring all of these things upon them so they'll be able to take it on after his death. And it was just a very similar type of statement thing.
Very similar indeed, yeah. In verse 31, we get that Satanas has claimed the whole group of you, as Ruden has it, for himself. Now, this is not clear in the King James Version, right? You have, in English, you can be singular or plural.
Uh-huh.
And so what's happening here is the first you is plural, the second you is singular. So, Simon, Simon, look, Satanas has claimed the whole group of you for himself to sift like grain. But I've pleaded on your behalf. Now, that you is still ambiguous, but this is singular, right? This is just to Peter, so that your own loyalty won't fall short. But of course it will. We know that. Jesus knows that. The author knows that, right?
Yeah. This is part of the narrative here of Peter's denial. Yeah.
And so it goes on to say, but once you've turned back, meaning once you realize what you've done and you turn back, give your brothers some backbone. So it's, we quote this scripture a lot, right? In the King James Version, when you're converted, strengthen your brethren, right? I think it becomes something much more general than what I see here. This is very, very specific to this incident. I do see how it can be generalized, but I thought it was important to point out its original intent is very specific.
Yeah, Jesus seems to be talking about what is imminently going to happen here. He's going to be turned over, and then everybody's going to want to run away, which is what happens, right? In the narrative, they all go away. And Jesus is saying, hey, once you figure out, and change your mind on this, Peter, and turn back, as he says, then you need to gather everybody back together. You're going to be the one to do that. So that it is more clear in these other translations from the KJV that first you is plural and the second is singular, and that kind of makes it make a little more sense as to what's going on. Another thing with this verse here, Christopher, that I was noting from some of the footnotes is that this word that is translated in the NRSV as demanded, Satan has demanded, or in the KJV, Satan has desired. Another way to translate this is Satan has obtained permission to sift all of you. And immediately when I saw that in the footnote, I thought, wow, that's really Joby, right? Like back in Job, Satan goes to God and gets permission from God to tempt Job. And so here it's almost a similar thing going on. Jesus is telling him that Satan's gotten permission to sift you or to tempt you, right? And sure enough, some of the commentary says that is potentially what is intended here by the author by using this verb, is to sort of reference Job.
That is interesting. I didn't pick up on that. Ben, going back to what you said about Peter changing his mind, I do think he changes his mind, right? He does repent, as it were, metanoia, change of mind, right? But that's not the verb that's used here. It's just turn back, right? So once you've turned back is a good translation. So I thought that was interesting because I thought behind the turn back I would find metanoia, and that's not what the Greek has.
Well, I think that's going to come in place at the end of this chapter when we get to Peter's actual denial, because, turning back and looking and what Peter sees and what he doesn't see and what he doesn't want to look at, right? These are all things that are going to come into place.
Yes, exactly. We'll come to that.
Yeah. So the next things here, Christopher, these next verses that I want to say are I call these the sword verses, right? These are some of the sword verses.
That's funny to me as a Quran scholar.
Yeah, I call them the sword verses because these are just incessantly cited whenever the concept of nonviolence is brought up. Jesus taught nonviolence, and like, oh, no, Jesus said get a sword. Therefore, that means that it's okay to kill people with swords because Jesus said get a sword.
Well, if only it stopped there, Ben.
Yeah, if only it stops there. Yeah.
Because of this verse, anything goes, right?
Yeah. When we actually look at what's going on in these verses, and we have several things to say about them in some layers here, but when we actually look at what's going on in these verses, it makes more sense as to what these swords are doing. So he said to them, this is verse 35, "When I sent you out without a purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything? They said, no, not a thing. He said to them, but now the one who has a purse must take it, and likewise a bag. And the one who has no sword must sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you, this scripture must be fulfilled in me. And he was counted among the lawless. And indeed, what is written about me is being fulfilled. They said, Lord, look, here are 2 swords. He replied, it is enough." Okay, so he's telling them to bring swords. Why? He explains, so that a scripture would be fulfilled. What scripture? The scripture about him being counted among the lawless, which, by the way, is from Isaiah chapter 53. That's the chapter, one of the chapters talking about the suffering servant. So this is Jesus identifying himself with the chapters about the suffering servant, or in some traditions, you would say that is also the Messiah. It's not always the same person, but in this tradition where we're talking here, it would be the same person, that person of Jesus. And how is it that he would be counted among the lawless? Well, they would be among the lawless if they have weapons, well, at all, right? Obvious weapons, swords that can't be hidden, right? You can't hide a sword under cloak, unlike the daggers that some of the zealots had that were, in later years doing assassinations in crowds. So they had to bring swords so these couldn't be hidden, so that they could be obvious to the authorities that they had weapons. So 2 is enough. Well, it's not enough to defend themselves against what's coming, which is, a whole mob or a whole crowd of people that's coming out to get them, which in John includes Roman soldiers, and we'll get to that. It's not enough to defend themselves. So what's it enough to do? It's just enough to fulfill the scripture that he's going to be among the lawless. So the swords are not for defense. They are simply to fulfill the scripture.
And so they're certainly not for offense either.
Yes, exactly.
Because what the scripture is saying, what it's saying in Isaiah is that you would be considered among the lawless. It's not that you are among the lawless, right?
Yeah.
It runs contrary to, any violence runs contrary to Jesus' teachings, right? The core of Jesus' teachings are in the Sermon on the Mount, and they're nonviolent.
Sarah Rudin, in her commentary, actually says some of the same things that we were thinking, is that these verses about that Luke has here about the swords, bringing the swords, could potentially be insertions by Luke to explain the existence of the sword later in the narrative when a person chops the ear off of another person, which in some of the accounts, this person is Peter. In some of the accounts, it doesn't name him at all.
It just says someone.
It's just someone, yeah.
And as a matter of fact, it's not really clear where the sword comes from. And I think it's in the Gospel of Matthew that we get someone reaching out their hand and taking his sword. So the pronoun his is used. And I think we read it as his own, but it looks like he could have actually reached out and taken someone else's sword. So they don't actually have swords with them at all. But if Luke doesn't know that and he's trying to explain how there's a sword in play, he has to come up with some kind of explanation, and this is what he does.
Yeah. And the reason I think that is a good potential explanation, I don't know that it actually, it is what it is, but it is a good potential explanation, is that this narrative about him telling him to bring swords is a little odd, because selling their cloak and buying a sword, I don't know that that's even a possibility at night. I mean, they're in the middle of the night right now, and I'm not sure you can go somewhere and buy a sword in the middle of the night. And the second thing is, he tells them to do that, but then they say, oh, well, we have a couple swords already right here. And I don't know why they had swords just lying around, in this upper room where they're having a dinner that, the room doesn't belong to any of them. They just have a couple swords sitting around for some reason.
Yeah, the more we talk about it and the more I think about it, the more it looks like Luke is just trying to explain where the sword came from that cuts off the ear. And again, looking at Matthew, it looks like it even could have come from someone other than the disciple, although a disciple did reach for it, right? And he does get rebuked, right? And by the way, why is this verse not quoted? This is so typical, right? So let me explain why we can be violent. Jesus said, buy a sword. Okay, well, we've already covered that. I'm not sure he said that, right? But then now, Jesus did say, he's quoted as saying here also, no, put away your sword. And he heals the guy whose ear gets cut off.
Yeah, here in Luke, we have him healing the ear. Now, the other Gospels don't say that, but Luke does. And then in Matthew, there's no, like you were saying, Christopher, just he's reaching out and grabbing this sword from somewhere. Not clear where.
Ben, now that you point that out, it's interesting that Luke, who seems to be trying to explain where the sword came from that cut off someone's ear, is the one who says Jesus healed the ear.
Yeah.
He seems to want to maintain the commitment to Jesus's nonviolence.
Right.
And he's pinning it on one of the disciples.
So once they get into the garden here, now, we kind of skipped ahead with the actual cutting off of the ear, but we're going to go back and look at these verses 43 and 44 before the ear chopping happens. These verses, which talk first about an angel and then talk about Jesus's sweating, these verses are lacking in some early manuscripts. Not all of them, but some of the early manuscripts. So it's possible that these verses were added in at a later time and then got into some of the other manuscripts. So again, in verse 43, we have an angel appearing to him. Latter-day Saint commentators have called this angel Michael, who then is identified with Adam in the Latter-day Saint tradition. So anyway, just a side note there. The next thing here in verse 44 is we have that his sweat became like great drops of blood.
Wait, I thought he sweat blood.
So this is a simile. This isn't literal. This is a simile that his sweat was like great drops of blood.
Right. It really stood out to me here in Rudin's translation. She writes, and in his anguish, he prayed more strenuously, and his sweat became like clots of blood falling on the ground. And so I went back to the King James and I found that it's the same thing, right? It's as if it were blood.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not that it was blood, right?
Now, in the Latter-day Saint tradition, we do have that at some point Jesus bled from every pore. And this comes from Doctrine and Covenants section 19, and it comes from Mosiah chapter 3, verse 7. Now, when we got to this part, I remembered that we had recorded an episode back when we did Doctrine and Covenants. Shiloh and I did Doctrine and Covenants. And section 19, this is, if anybody wants to go back and listen to this is episode number 40 of the Come Follow Me. Doctrine and Covenants sections 18 and 19. And in section 19, it talks about suffering and bleeding from every pore. And when we discuss this, We talk about it for about 10 minutes, so I would highly recommend go back and look at it or listen to it. When we discussed this, we talked about the hyperbole that's involved in this statement of bleeding from every pore. And Shiloh did some math, and Christopher, you said your son did some math on this as well.
He did, and we covered this also on Latter-day Contemplation in a recent episode where we talked about how sometimes we take things a little too literally.
Yeah, and the idea here is that if this were a literal thing, that somebody's bleeding from every pore, it would be more blood, like way more blood than is in the human body at all. And so it's just not really a thing that this is a literal happening that's going on.
Ben, my son has it at 140 gallons per second.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to calculate a rate of this because I don't see a time here. But in any case, it would be too much, right? And this is a metaphor for the experience that Jesus had. And we get this the same in Mosiah. And when you look at the context of these verses, it really makes a lot more sense to look at it as this hyperbolic metaphor. And it's teaching us something about what we're to understand about our human experience, the experience of Jesus. And again, Shiloh and I go into it for a while on that episode. So if you're interested into a little bit longer explanation, I would recommend going back to that.
Yeah, I do trust my son a lot. So I'm going to say he probably meant, even if it were 1 second, that's 140 gallons, right?
Yeah.
If you get 2 seconds, it's another 140 gallons.
Yeah. Again, this might be difficult for some people who are used to this narrative of the bleeding to swallow, but remember that there's something deeper that's happening in this teaching than is the literalness. And that's the more important part. And again, this concept of the bleeding from every pore really comes in the Latter-day Saint tradition in Mosiah and D&C 19, but we don't find it in Luke chapter 22 because it doesn't say that. It says the sweat became like great drops of blood. In order, it's talking about the intensity of the blood as a metaphor, as a simile for the strain that's happening to Jesus right now in some way. Yeah.
Right. By the way, for the record, I love similes. And that's one of the reasons I love the Iliad so much. It's the similes I love. And they're deeply meaningful, right? Because they paint a picture of some deeper meaning than just the face value, right? Yeah. So that you can keep, right? Just don't take it literally.
Yeah.
So now we come to the episode where the sword comes into play. Judas comes, kisses Jesus. Jesus says, "Oh, so you're handing me over with a kiss. Right? You're handing over the Son of Mankind with a kiss, right?" But those who saw him, they saw what was going to happen. They say, "Master, what if we strike with a sword?" Now I'm reading from Ruden's translation. The thing that I notice here, Ben, is it's not really clear who they're talking about striking with a sword. To me, the readily apparent meaning is Judas. Let's stop him. I don't know. It could be, again, this idea of defending themselves from whoever's there, which should only be Jews, right? But there's one gospel that says even the Romans were there. We'll come to that. That's John, right? So I don't know who they're talking about striking with a sword, but they say, "Master, what if we strike with a sword?" And one of them, someone, struck the chief priest's slave and took off his right ear. And so we don't get the name of the person who struck with the sword. And over in the Gospel of John, we actually get the name of the slave. We also get that it was Peter, right, who struck with the sword.
Peter and Malchus, yeah.
But it's interesting here, right, that we don't even get the name of who struck. I wouldn't expect the name of the slave. That actually surprised me in John, right?
Yeah.
What do I do with that? It seems like useless information, right?
I don't know. If you were writing like fan fiction, right, then you would do something with Malchus after this episode because he gets his ear healed, right? And then, Malchus is going to go on to become, some great Christian missionary or something, right?
Sure. Let the listener know that Ben said, if you're writing fan fiction. Otherwise, probably useless information. Although I don't know. To me, again, I pause and I think about it. And I think, what is the meaning of having this name here? And then I remember the streaker, the unnamed streaker. What's he doing there, right? I'm talking about Mark 14, right? Where you have this unidentified person who must be well-to-do because he's wearing a linen loincloth. Now, he's not wearing anything else. Most everybody wears wool, right? So he just runs off and leaves his clothes behind a la Joseph, right? Because somebody's trying to stop him. In verse 52, Rudin has Then Jesus said to those who'd come against him, the high priests and the commanders of the temple guards and the elders, "You've come out against me with swords and clubs as if I were a bandit." Now you said, Ben, that you thought a better word would be brigand, right?
Yeah, to me, bandit can be just an individual acting on their own, like a thief or a robber, right? Or somebody mugging someone, right? But brigand, it seems more appropriate because what they're referencing here are organized groups of criminals or insurrectionists that live kind of outside or on the fringe of society and may occasionally perform organized crime or something,
Yeah, it's interesting because Rudin agrees with you on what this is, but she still calls it a bandit, right? She says bandits were groups who have strongholds in the wilderness and could function as insurrectionists. Yeah. So they're a group, they have support, they have probably people outside the city with weapons, right? They're organized. It's not somebody, it's not some loose cannon, right? Somebody flying solo. And so then backing up a little bit to the temple guards and the elders. So what's unusual about this story, Ben, is that the people that are making the arrest would normally be avoiding any kind of disruption like this, right?
Altercation.
Any kind of altercation, anything that's going to disturb the peace, especially to do it in such a provocative manner, right? And the question is, would the Roman regime have ever actually authorized such a move, right? And then even if they had, would the Jews have really then carried it out in the middle of the night during an important festival? Now, against fellow celebrants, as Rudin puts it. Now, of course, night would be better than during the day, right? But why not just wait until after the festival? Jesus himself is going to say, "You've seen me teaching in the temple and the synagogues, right? You had so many, if you had a problem with me, you had so many opportunities to say something, and you didn't. And so why now?" That's a good question, right? It's a valid question.
Well, and I think one of the points of the story is exactly that, that this is something that is not normal that they're doing to Jesus, right? They're going out of their way to target him. And I think that's probably part of the intent of the authors here to highlight that.
Yeah, and that means if we take that a little further, right, we could be getting into hyperbole. And if we haven't gotten there yet, we may still, right? Yeah. As we go through this story.
Next, we have the Luke account of Peter's denial. And there's something unique about it that I think is really fascinating. When Peter denies these multiple times, in the Gospel of Luke, we get this verse 61 after Peter denies the third time and the cock crowed. Verse 61, "The Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, 'Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times.' And he went out and wept bitterly." This moment where the Lord turns and looks at Peter, this brings in the concept of the eyes and the face being central to the humanity and the identity of a person. And this brings up some of the ideas from René Girard here. But the point being that Peter can't deny his relationship internally anymore now that he's actually looked in the eyes or seen the face of Jesus looking back at him. And sure enough, the point is driven home in the very next verse, because what happens, it says, "Now the men who were holding Jesus began to mock him and beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, 'Prophesy, who is it that struck you?' They kept heaping many other insults on him." Now, when we talked about this word blindfolded before, Christopher, you mentioned that this isn't necessarily just covering the eyes. This is like maybe wrapping the whole head in a veil, and a couple functions that could be going on here. One would be obviously to blind him. The other being that they are covering his face, which to the point before, right, this is a way that for them to make him less human, right, to take away his humanity, so then it's easier for them to beat him or to mock him. And then the third thing that you brought up, Christopher, was that this might even be a way of them emasculating him, because veiling someone was typically a feminine type of thing. So if they're doing this to him, they might be, sort of emasculating him.
That's right. And that was brought up by Rudin. And, so I guess there's one more, since we have a good list going. We may as well make it as exhaustive as possible. Obviously, if they're arresting him, they want him disoriented too.
Yes. Yeah. That's the point of the blindfold or covering the face. Right.
In finishing up this chapter, Ben, I'd like to talk about the last few verses from 67 through the end. it becomes almost, this is Luke we're talking about, right? But it looks a lot like John, right? It starts to become really ambiguous and mysterious, right? Let's look at this. In Ruden's translation, 67, and said, "If you're the anointed one, tell us." But he said to them, "If I told you, there's no way you'd believe me. And if I asked, there's no way you'd answer. But from now on, the Son of Mankind will be seated to the right of God's power." Now, I want to stop right there because there are quote marks here, right? And if I told you, there's no way you'd believe me. And if I asked, there's no way you'd answer, are all in the quote marks that belonging to Jesus. The Greek doesn't have quote marks. This is as Ruden's interpreting it, right? It occurred to me that maybe it makes more sense to say, "And if I asked, there's no way you'd answer," comes from Jesus's interlocutor, not from Jesus. But either way, it's just strange, right? It's probably more strange if it comes from Jesus. But from now on, the Son of Mankind will be seated to the right of God's power. Then they all said, "That means you're God's son?" But he addressed them, "You say I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We've heard it ourselves from his own mouth." And I thought, wait a minute, when did he say? Right? He didn't say yes. He said, "You say I am."
Yeah.
Now, this could be idiomatically, it could be the same thing as saying yes, right? I guess an English equivalent would be something like, "You said it, not me."
Yeah.
And you're implying, I'm not taking responsibility for saying it, even though it is the case, right?
Well, the other way in English we say something like this, though, that means something quite different is "if you say so."
Right.
And "if you say so" kind of flips that, because "if you say so" is actually no, but, I'm not going to argue with you because, you're not worth arguing with. I don't.
Right. And to me, that's where I was thinking of what happens next in John, because right after he says, whatever you want to say, "if you say so," or "you said it, not me," whatever it is. So in the Gospel of John, right after he says, "You said it, not me," or whatever, however you want to translate that, he says, "I'm here to testify of the truth." So he says what he's actually doing and what his role actually is and what it means to him. So you can call me whatever you want to call me. I'm just here to do this. I'm here to testify of truth.
Yeah. Speaking of John.
Yeah. Now that we've referred multiple times to John, let's go into John. Let's see if there's anything left to talk about. Ben, the first thing I see in chapter 18 from John, right, is that in Ruden's translation, we have this brook that flows only in winter. So once he said these things, Jesus went out with his students across the Kedron, a brook that flows only in winter. Now, you said in King James, right, it's only the Kidron. There's not even a brook mentioned, yet alone that it only flows in winter.
Well, same with NRSV. It's the same. It doesn't mention that it's anything about water at all.
And yet, behind these translations, the Greek says a winter brook, right? So it actually really is a winter brook. Now, what does that mean? Why does it matter? I don't know. Maybe it doesn't. But I thought it was interesting.
Well, I need to backtrack on that a little bit because I did just refer to the KJV again. And it does say the brook Kedron, but in the NRSV it says valley, it doesn't say brook.
So at least there's a brook, but the idea that it only flows in winter that you thought sounded like something Ruden just made up, turns out that it's actually in the Greek word.
It's actually in the Greek, yeah. It's strange that it would be left out in these other translations, the fact that it was,
right.
It's like...
And once again, like the name of the slave whose ear was cut off, like the streaker who's unnamed. I don't know that these things matter, but to me, they're curious. They're a little mysterious. And so I may, ponder on them. I may reflect on them. I may contemplate them, right?
They're oddities. They stand out, just like the man that would be carrying the jar of water, right?
There's another one, all from this week's reading, Yeah. So I see now we start piling them up and I think, okay, we can't just dismiss these offhand, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know what to do with them.
Yeah. They're puzzle pieces that don't fit.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The next thing that stood out to me is that Judas is said here in verse 3 to have a military division at his disposal, right? That's in Ruden's translation, it's a military division. But the point is that he's actually able to command or, again, has at his disposal Roman soldiers and that they come into the picture. They're not there in the other tellings, right? And here's where we start to push into hyperbole a little bit. It becomes so unbelievable that you wonder if the rhetorical nature of the text is such that what it wants to say is what? How would you put it, Ben?
So it would be something like all things are, combining against Jesus here. All these forces of evil, so to speak. Evil's probably not the right word, but the Romans and Judas and the chief priests, right? They're all in league against Jesus.
Right. Something's happening, right? The Romans are going to crucify Jesus. And as a matter of fact, that's one of the least disputed facts in the story of Jesus of Nazareth, right? Among scholars, Jesus was crucified. But to have all of these, as you said, it's almost as if nature herself were conspiring against Jesus, right? And so that's rhetorically, I think, how this functions.
As we mentioned already, Christopher, Simon draws the sword, cuts the ear off of Malchus. We get this statement from the author about Caiaphas. In verse 14, Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was better to have one person die for the people. Now, in the context of the Gospel of John, and also considering the commentary we've brought in from Girard on this, the idea that we have this one person dying for the people, this is the scapegoat that's going on. We talked about the mocking and the blindfolding, dying of the personhood that happens, or the humanity that happens earlier. Earlier in the book of John, we have the woman taken in adultery. Again, Caiaphas is mentioned multiple times as this one who, quote unquote, prophesies that Jesus would die for the people. And the author says he didn't know what he was saying, right? And so it's brought up again here to kind of drive the point home that what's going on is this conspiracy against Jesus to have him die for the people, but they don't really realize what they're doing.
Notice too, along with our discussion in former episodes and on Latter-day Contemplation on Girard's theory, that even his disciples become part of the mob and sort of abandon him, right? Even Peter, who swore up and down that he wouldn't. Actually, the swearing comes after, right? The swearing happens when he's asked, hey, aren't you one of Jesus's followers, right? But it happens to him too, right? They all become part of the mob it's mimetic, right? Did you just do what everybody else is doing? There's the mob mentality, even Peter himself.
Yeah, just like Caiaphas doesn't really realize what he's saying, they all don't really realize what they're doing, right? This is impulsive. They're following the mob, the mimetic violence type of thing. And it's this moment Peter doesn't realize it's the cock crowing that wakes him up. And I think that's a fascinating imagery there. He kind of wakes up, or he sees the face of the Lord, and then the cock crows. Back in Luke, it talked about him seeing the Lord looking over at him. And then he's woken up in that moment. And just like earlier where Jesus says, Simon, Simon, Satan has demanded to sift you, all of you. But I have prayed for you that what does Rudin say? She says, your loyalty would fail not. And so when you wake up from this, when you realize what's going on and you break free of this mimetic mob violence, hey, you need to put things back together and bring everybody together, right? This kind of thing. And I think this is kind of the moment that is at least acutely referenced by that statement of Jesus directly to Simon earlier.
And again, from a Girardian standpoint, it's really important that there is this moment that Peter has where he does wake up, right? Because the scapegoat mechanism only works if you fall for it. It only works if you don't snap out of it, as it were. And so when he snaps out of it and recognizes Jesus again as an innocent victim, that's when the scapegoat mechanism fails. And that's what Girard thinks is unique about Christianity, right? Is this identification with the victim. And in today's society where Christianity has been rejected by many, right? You still have the core of Christianity present. And in fact, it's become perverted somewhat because our identification with the victim has gone too far in the sense that now people want to be identified as victims so that they can get an advantage for themselves. Right? Yeah.
So they bring Jesus in and they start questioning him. And then he's talking to them and they hit him. So verse 32, when he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" So when I was reading this verse, it reminded me of a quote from William Godwin. Again, Jesus is talking with them and they strike him. And he says, "Why did you strike me? It just correct me. If what I said is wrong, then you say what is right. There's no need to hit me." William Godwin says this. He says, If he who employs coercion against me could mold me to his purposes by argument, no doubt he would. He pretends to punish me because his argument is strong, but he really punishes me because his argument is weak. So I just thought that fit this so well. Jesus is looking at him and saying, look, if you really have an argument that's stronger than my argument, then you give your argument. But your argument isn't stronger than my argument, so you're trying to employ violence as if that is a better argument.
Yeah, I like that.
Later, when they bring Jesus into the Romans to Pilate, they're asked, what is he accused of? This is verse 29. So Pilate went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? They answered, if this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you. Okay, so I had to chuckle a little bit at this. This is like circular reasoning, right? The fact that we arrested him means he's guilty. Pilate, we wouldn't have arrested him if he weren't guilty. This just kind of, reminds me of these things that happen sometimes when people get arrested and the charge is resisting arrest.
Right.
Like they get arrested for resisting arrest. And it's like, wait, which came first? Okay. It's like, you didn't answer the question. I asked you what he's accused of. And he's like, oh, you don't need to know what he's accused of. He's guilty. Now, I understand that, due process and all that sort of stuff weren't a thing back then, right? If the Roman governor, there wasn't really the type of presumed innocent until proven guilty and real type of trial and stuff concepts that we have of now exactly. But again, this is still circular logic. They didn't answer the question of what he's accused of.
Yeah, and no matter what the courtroom drama would look like at that time, this is not that, right? That's the other thing. This is a kangaroo court. It's a mock trial, right?
So Pilate responds to them and just says, well, judge him according to your law. If you think he's guilty, then you take him and you do a trial. And they say, no, he needs to die and we're not permitted to put him to death. And so we have to bring him to you so that you can, because you need to put him to death. And then the next verse, for verse 32, this was to fulfill what Jesus said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. Okay, in other words, crucifixion. Because if the Jews were to judge him, and when I say the Jews, I'm talking in the John sense here, right? So this is the authorities of the Jews. If they were to try him and execute him, their law was stoning, right? For the blasphemies, for everything that they're accusing him of. They would have stoned him. But Jesus had said he was going to be crucified. And so what John is saying here is that, no, this couldn't have been the Jews to do it because it would have been a stoning. He has to go to the Romans. This is all according to plan because Jesus said it would happen this way. All according to plan, he has to go to the Romans because he has to die by crucifixion. And that's a Roman punishment. The Jews don't crucify people.
Yeah, Ben, that brings a couple of thoughts to my mind. And one of them is, as we discussed this when we talked about the woman taken in adultery, right? There's not actually stoning happening. It already wasn't happening and already hasn't been happening for a long time. And they couldn't do that anyway. Even if they were doing it, which they weren't, they would not be allowed to do it under Roman rule.
Right.
So they couldn't do anything, right? They couldn't do the stoning. They couldn't do the crucifixion. They couldn't do any of it. And that reminds me of a Quran verse, which is in Surah An-Nisa, which is the fourth surah, ayah 157. It says, they did not kill him and they did not crucify him, but it was made to appear so to them, or something like that. That verb is a little tricky because it's a hapax legomen and it only occurs one time in the text. But who are they, right? They are in the previous verse. The Jews are bragging that they killed Jesus. And the text is saying, no, they did not kill him and they did not crucify him.
And this is interpreted different ways. Sometimes it's interpreted as Jesus wasn't crucified, and sometimes it's interpreted as they weren't the ones who did it.
That's right. Yeah. So the common interpretation nowadays is that Jesus wasn't crucified, that someone was substituted, and that's what's meant by it was made to appear so to them. But originally, and earlier in Islam, it was interpreted as they didn't do it, right? The Jews didn't do it. And that's, I think, what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
And by the way, that's because the Romans did it. Yeah. Or another way to interpret it, which works either in Christianity or in Islam or in Judaism, would be God did it.
Yeah. According to the book of John, especially, this was part of God's plan.
That's right.
And in fact, Jesus does say at some point, no man taketh my life from me, but I give it. freely.
That's right.
This is him that has decided this is the way it's supposed to be.
And that's God speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So during this discussion that Jesus is having with Pilate, this exchange, he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over." Okay, so in other words, Jesus' followers are part of a kingdom that doesn't need to employ violence to achieve its ends, because their ends are something else. They're not an empire. They're not requiring or not demanding, dominance over other people by physical force.
Or tribute.
Right?
Yeah.
So again, he keeps having this exchange back and forth with Pilate. Pilate says, "Are you a king?" You were talking about this earlier, Christopher. "So you are a king." Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate says, "Oh, he's just talking about truth and, these metaphysical concepts." So Pilate just throws out this perennial philosopher question, right? Probably what he knows from his philosophical training. The fun question that you throw out. What is truth? And then he leaves. He goes out. After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no case against him." But Pilate wasn't looking for an answer from Jesus about this, what is truth. What he's saying, this is rhetorical, what he's saying is, he's just a philosopher. He's just concerned with these philosophical questions. So when he goes out and talks with them, he's like, look, this guy's harmless. There's nothing to charge him with because he's just, teaching philosophy.
Yeah, that really helps, I think, make clear this, especially when you look at right when he says, "What is truth?" right? And then sort of how it goes next and the punctuation. And it just doesn't make sense if he's actually asking Jesus that question, because there's no answer. And it also doesn't explain the way you've explained why he finds no cause to convict Jesus, right? He's just a philosopher. He's just asking these questions that no one can answer anyway.
This makes me think of Plato, where it's just like, what is justice? It's like, oh man, I don't really want to get into the whole discussion about what is justice. What I'm just saying is, he's just a philosopher. What is truth, right? Go for it.
Yeah, I was trained as a philosopher, and Riley wanted to record an episode for Latter-day Contemplation on the question, what is justice? And I thought, no, I don't want to do this. Can I just explain to you, Riley, why? We ended up doing it. I'm glad we did. But it's a big question. So the other thing that I wanted to, if you could just read again, there's something I want to point out.
Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice."
Yeah, so I think, we can misread this in a couple of ways. So when Pilate says, "So you're a king?" Jesus answers and he says, "You say I'm a king." See, now I already changed the enunciation, right, Ben? I'm putting the emphasis on you.
Yeah.
You say that I'm a king. And then it says, "For this came I into the world." I think you can read that as, I came into the world so that you could call me a king.
Huh.
I think that's a bad reading, right? So, because what he's saying is, "For this came I into the world, right? I don't know if that helps because...
Yeah, this is referring to what follows, not what precedes.
Right. That's what's meant by a colon, for those of you who are wondering, what is a colon? It's those two dots, right? And that is, what does he say?
To testify to the truth.
To testify to the truth. And I was talking about this earlier. I wanted to make sure we touched on it. So Pilate says, "I find no guilt in him. But," verse 39, "it's your custom that I release one person to you on the Pascha." I'm not sure how that works. I'm in charge. It's your custom that I do what you want me to do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, he wouldn't have really cared what their custom was.
Well, there are lots of things to say here, right? The one thing is, how does their custom determine what the ruler does? Another thing, as you said, is we do know who Pilate was. We have lots of historical records on Pilate, and I don't think he cared anything about what anybody wanted him to do. He did what he wanted to do. And in fact, I'm reminded of a line from Plato. It's from Plato, right? He says, and this is actually in the mouth of Thrasymachus in a dialogue. I think it's in the Republic. He says, "The strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. That's a good description of how Pilate ran things.
Yeah.
So this is really kind of interesting, right? And
justice is the advantage of the stronger, Thrasymachus says. That's right.
Yeah. Yes. So I think this goes again to hyperbole. I'm going to let you comment on that.
Yeah. And, the commentary on this, Christopher, says that this custom is not attested anywhere else outside the New Testament. Like, this probably wasn't really a custom. It's just something that for some reason is put in the mouth of Pilate here. And this goes to the point that we were talking about earlier of this hyperbolic conspiracy that everything is combining against Jesus here. Even, them trying to release him according to this custom, which doesn't seem to exist. They won't do it because, they want Jesus's head, so to speak, right? They want him crucified. And, so no matter what, they're going to do it, even if it means letting Barabbas, who is a murderer and insurrectionist, which they would not have allowed, even if it means letting him go free, they want to get Jesus. So that's the hyperbole there that's going on.
And that's where I was going to go next, is to Barabbas, right? Because Barabbas means son of the Father. Well, rhetorically, that's interesting too, right? Because that's who Jesus says he is.
Yeah, especially in John, right? Yeah, my Father.
So which son of the Father are we going to crucify here is the question. And Barabbas, as you pointed out, is an insurrectionist. And so even if Pilate would do such a thing as let someone go of their choice, it wouldn't be an insurrectionist. There's just no way he can do that.
Yeah, as a Roman, and again, as Pilate himself, you talked about how we have these historical records. Pilate was not shy at all about crucifying people all the time. Yeah, that was nothing for him. That was just a Thursday.
So this goes to, just a Thursday. So this goes again to hyperbole, right? So he would have crucified both of them, without batting an eyelid.
That's John 18.
That's John 18.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode of Come Follow Me. We want to give a thanks to all those who participate in the project with us, our editor Kyle, and those who we are trying to onboard as editors as well. We appreciate their willingness to participate in the project with us. Thanks so much to you, Christopher. Thanks to Riley. Thanks to Des. Thanks to Bethany, and all those others that help us with the project and contribute and support. All the people that donate on a monthly basis, you guys help cover the costs of this. They're minimal costs, but it is still really great to have that coming in to help cover those costs. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Ben.